Stephen King's movie adaptations tend to be a hit or miss when going into the film history, but overall, with this new adaptation of Mr. Harrigan's Phone, now on Netflix, from John Lee Hancock being the director, overall it's getting the lower end of the spectrum of not being praised so highly, at least what the initial reviews were getting. But does it live up to that really, and does it deserve that low rating? Like a young boy befriends an elderly billionaire, Mr. Harrigan, and eventually Craig gives him a phone, and after Mr. Harrigan dies, Craig finds out he can communicate with him through the grave. So going into this film, I knew very little about the premise alone, and just the idea, having not read the novella it's based on from Stephen King, but overall there was a bit of intrigue throughout the whole thing. There was a bit of subtleness that really captivated me by the way they really set up the cinematography to always put the central point and always do some great film techniques that shows the directing style and the cinematography style is always on point to drawing the viewer in, creating a captivating audience, and bringing in this warm and cozy vibe to the fall and autumn type setting. And just the way they're setting that up is much more subtle than I expected, and obviously this is more based on a novella than a whole novel, and putting it into the hour and 47-minute mark sometimes feels like that could be a bit too long, and that's where some of the other adaptations of novellas or short stories tend to fail, because it feels like you're having a whole lot of extra stuff stuffed in there. And so with this mark, the story is much more subtle, on the nose of what they're shooting for. They have the theme and message, and it doesn't feel like they're putting too much in there. Obviously I haven't read the book, but even if they are adding in so much content to the story to make it to this full-length feature film, it still becomes compelling throughout the film, to where I'm captivated and intrigued to see where it's going. And while there wasn't any huge surprises, ultimately I was still on board with what they were doing, the message about cell phones and how we seem so sucked into it. And one little problem I had was, like, when they go into the cafeteria of the school, Craig and none of the other students are eating food, and so I'm not sure what sort of period is that. But it's also to express the message that every single person was on their phone, or that had phones, and each had their own groups based on the type of phone. And it's definitely a different style, because that's based on 2003, and not sure what that culture was like. But overall, Jaden Patel as Greg and Donald Sutherland as Mr. Harrigan had this great persona that really engaged with the audience, and having Craig's friends being on the background, they were solid side characters. They didn't add a whole lot, and you don't get a whole lot to their background, their stories, their family, and as well as the bully that is first engaged with Craig. But the way they go about that is simple enough, telling the premise, telling the story from that premise, and becomes engaging because of the way they're expressing this theme of how phones are sort of taking over. And obviously Stephen King wrote this afterwards, whereas the character Mr. Harrigan is sort of, in one sense, predicting somewhat of the future of how phones are taking over our life, becoming too essential for us to really give up in order to connect with the rest of the world. It just becomes still engaging, and I feel like the lower Rotten Tomatoes score is not very deserving. And so, before I give you my final rating, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss on any upcoming videos. But that leaves my rating of Mr. Harrigan's Phone to be at 85%. And so that's just my personal thoughts on this film, and I'd love to know your thoughts on the latest Netflix film from Stephen King's adaptation. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out my top 10 Stephen King movies.